Greetings and welcome to Edgy Ideas, the podcast that explores what it means to live the good life and create the good society in our disruptive age. My name is Simon Western, and I will be talking to invited guests about diverse topics, exploring social conscious and unconscious dynamics and desires. Edgy Ideas is proudly sponsored by the Eco Leadership Institute. We offer coach and leadership training courses, and we have a vibrant community of practice where international members join once a month for a webinar. Our focus is on co-creating the good society. To find out more, go to www.ecoleadershipinstitute.org, and to read my polemic blogs and essays, go to Simon Western at Substack. Thank you for listening. So welcome everybody to this edition of Edgy Ideas podcast. Today's special guest is Susan Kahn. Susan is a business psychologist, an executive coach, consultant, academic, and an observer of working life. She's a chartered psychologist and supervisor with the British Psychological Society and a fellow at the Association of Business Psychologists. Susan has a particular interest in the behavior of people at work and below the surface dynamics in organizations. She studied organizational consultancy using psychoanalytic methods at the Tavistock, and she did her PhD at Birkbeck University, London, where she teaches coaching psychology, and she established a master's in coaching psychology. She also works as a group relations consultant. Susan uses psychoanalytic observation as a research method and has written about psychoanalysis of endings and of resilience. And her latest book is about reinvention. Susan, you're really welcome to Edgy Ideas. It's lovely to see you. How are you today?
I'm good, Simon, as good as one can be at the moment. And I'm really pleased to see you and have a chance to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, I've trying to remember where we first met. Was it on the master's program in Birkbeck? Was that our initial meeting?
I think so, or maybe before that at Oak, where we had an encounter somewhere in Euston, no doubt, somewhere like that.
Yeah. I mean, I loved coming onto your master's program, and still occasionally pop in there to do some teaching. It's a very rich program you set up there. So congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. And I must give credit to, of course, Andreas Liefug set up the postgraduate certificate, and I then extended it into the master's. But the students really valued your perspective and that kind of challenge on who is a coach and what is coaching work. So you've made a great many friends on our coaching cohorts over the years.
And you've decided to write a book. We'll revisit your book during this conversation. Reinvent yourself. What stimulated that thought, that title, Susan?
Yeah, well, the title I think is pretty catchy, and you might not be surprised to know it wasn't my first title. The title I had was aligned to endings and beginnings, and the publisher, which was hoping to appeal to a broader audience, wanted to explore this idea of, yes, beginnings and endings, but this sense of all of us are aspiring to create a new version of ourselves at different stages in our life. And I found that the title seemed to work with the material I had planned. So we went with it, and I'm pleased with it now.
Yeah. I think it's a very apt title for our times. And people are very focused on their identity at the moment. It's kind of interesting, I think, more so than I've ever known, who we are, what makes us who we are, what tribe we belong to. All these things seem to be very dominant in people's minds at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's a very positive side to tribalism, this sense of belonging, of feeling sense of an affinity and shared values and joint purpose, which it can be really uplifting and energizing and make you feel, really a sense of belonging. And the opposite of it in terms of lack of tolerance of difference and I'm here, you're there, and there's just no way to meet in the middle, which can be really hard in these times to actually live with. So tribalism is contentious and very relevant at the moment.
Yeah, it's been something on my mind all my life, really. That I often feel like I'm an outsider, but at times I've been an insider, and at times you felt part of a community, and other times on the edge. And it can be a very seductive thing, which is abused by politicians, and abused by people, where they see people's desire for belonging and kind of exploit that at the expense of the other, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to my younger years, where I had a strong sense, growing up in a sort of a Thatcher era, of a very strong sense of where I belonged and what I was against, despite my kind of poshish accent and my sort of relatively sort of comfortable upbringing. I had a really clear idea of what side I was on and where I belonged and what I was fighting for. And it's just much messier now. And there's a great sort of weight on all of our shoulders. I don't want to be miserable, but I do feel quite bleak at the moment.
Yeah. Well, just before we jumped on the call, you talked about you just visited Israel, and you're a Jew living in London. And I'm sure you're feeling an awful lot of things at the moment. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. It's a pretty miserable time to face the evident rising anti-Semitism that is alive and well in the UK, in America, and really this sort of sleeping monster that doesn't take much to disturb it. So it does feel difficult, but in even saying those words, I'm very conscious of my empathy and sympathy for the suffering that's going on in Gaza, for the wish for both the Palestinian people and the people of Israel and the Jewish community around the world to find peace and have a homeland and to live alongside each other. So it feels a very sober time, and I am, just also returned from both a trip to Israel, where things are very tender, and a few miles away from a terrible war zone. I literally came back on Tuesday from Poland, where I was participating in something called the March of the Living, which you may have heard of, which is a gathering of thousands of people around the world to commemorate the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jewish global community just 80 years ago. So that was surprisingly uplifting, in that the number of people who were there from around the world, Arab Israelis for peace and recognizing the need to move forward with hope and light, young people, a global community. So there is hope, but there is also, I think, a lot of work to do in terms of understanding each other and engaging in dialogue and conversation, which is something I'm finding myself almost frightened to do. So it feels almost courageous to speak up here, because one is terrified about what one might invite, and accusations of hurt of the other, but also this very close to the surface suffering, which is I think present for the Jewish community, and of course for the Palestinian community as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. We talked before, and shall we talk about this, shan't we? It's and it feels dangerous, and it feels it feels hugely sensitive. I can hear voices of pro-Gaza and voices in my head saying, talk about this. I hear the pain of the Jewish community and the anti-Semitism, which clearly is rising. It's very, very troubling times.
And I'm also aware that, you do a lot of work for the Red Cross, who are seeing firsthand suffering that's impossible to unsee. And having just visited a number of the kibbutzim that were attacked on October the 7th, and seeing Sheryl Sandberg's film on the sexual violence against women, it's, this is dreadful, painful, horrific material to digest, to recognize as, humanity's, depravity against each other. And that's so sobering.
It is, yeah. No, I've been working with Save the Children, and they've
Save the Children, not Red Cross.
There's Rachel Cummins is one of their lead people, and she's actually in Gaza, at the moment, and just did a report back on Radio 4 yesterday, and it's it is beyond kind of belief. And as you say, that the suffering of what happened before on October 7th was just absolutely shocking. And just being in Poland, the other thing I'm working with is Ukraine war, so there's, it's like you're in Poland and the Holocaust, World War II, and the kind of like, the reverberations of what's happening there, like, is shaking us all, I think.
And I suppose, recognizing that both of us could sort of literally go down a very dark tunnel, that our gaze, moves very quickly from one crisis to another, and holding this sense of suffering that's going on in lots of other places as well, is really kind of challenging. That, Sudan and Syria and China, and of course Ukraine, which is, going on for so much longer than we all hoped. So there is, I think it's really quite hard to return sometimes to this sense of ourselves and what we can do with meaning in our lives, and to hold that in the context of a global landscape that may make us feel that we should just take to our beds and despair.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Sudan. I was in East Africa only a few weeks ago, and working with African leaders. And I have colleagues working very closely in Sudan, and I've been talking to people there. And it is hard to kind of hold all this together. The amount of trauma around, and I've been doing some work in Save the Children around how trauma gets metabolized, or not actually, more not, that it kind of gets parked, or it comes out in dysfunctional ways, or there's just huge defenses against it because, and we can't, it's, as a human, it is impossible to kind of absorb all the trauma in the world. It's just, you have to be selective in a way.
Yeah. And not to take us down an even darker tunnel, but of course this isn't going to be over in our lifetimes. These terrible conflicts continue through the generations. So I think we have to work really, really hard to have hope and to have belief, and to see light and embrace tolerance where we see it, and where there can be dialogue and an attempt at understanding, I think is really vital. And I hope that the students that are protesting, particularly at Columbia and Harvard, and now in Oxford, and who knows where next, will begin to have some dialogue between each other, so that there can be a sense of learning and holding, this sort of kind of, desperate kind of either or right, wrong, the sort of Kleinian sense of splitting is so vivid in our lives at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is hope, and there is, I was working in East Africa, and you hear the story of one of, I tell my story of my Simon story of kind of my career, and it's a way of kind of just getting other people to think about theirs. And
Yeah.
it was just amazing what stimulated, came out of that room. Somebody who kind of was in the Rwanda Holocaust and left with her father, thought her mother was dead, and kind of went illegally through Africa, ended up in South Africa. The Quakers kind of looked after them and schooled them and brought them
Yeah.
back. And she returns to Rwanda working for Save the Children as a humanitarian and meets her mother later on, who actually wasn't dead. So there is stories of kind of circularity where things, you go through great trauma and you see great courage and great inspiration. And
Yeah.
and I see that in when I'm working with people from Ukraine, so that there is this balancing side, and it's like, wow, what humans are capable of, as well as kind of both in terms of kind of devastation, but also courage and hope and building new lives and reinventing themselves.
Yeah, yeah, we're coming back. We we're trying hard to come back, aren't we, to the book. I suppose what we're exemplifying in our conversation is that sometimes it's hard to focus on the here and now when there are so many things that are, invading our conscious and unconscious minds with all that's going on. But let's do our best to try.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk a bit about your book, Reinventing Stuff. Is there something you'd like to read from it, just to share? Because it's a beautifully written book. I've looked at it and I really really enjoyed it, Susan. So, is there a passage you'd like to share with us?
Well, thank you. Yeah, yes. I mean, let's build on our conversation in a slightly kind of hopeful way, and let me share something from the book, which might not be news to all our listeners, but is something I think that's relevant in terms of reinvention. Um, and this relates to our perspective on the world. There's an Indian parable that tells of 6 blind men encountering an elephant and describing with certainty their experience of the creature. The man standing to its side talks of the elephant as a wall. The man at the tail describes the elephant as a piece of rope. The man at the head describes the elephant as a spear, and the man alongside the elephant's leg describes the animal as a tree, while the blind man by the flapping ears describes the elephant as a fan. Each is right in their own way, but in each sticking to their limited views, they miss the essence of the truth and the totality of the creature. John Godfrey Sachs in the 19th century retold this story as a poem, an iconic expression of humanity's tendency to claim truth with certainty, despite the limitations of their subjective experience. We might be described by clients, for example, as confident and clear thinking, by our leaders as shy and retiring, by our colleagues as humorous and bubbly, and by our siblings as morose and grumpy. Our school friends may see us as studious and bright, and our own assessment might be that we're dim and unaccomplished. All descriptions may hold truth, but none reflect the totality of our complex selves. We're like the blind men examining the elephant. We need to zoom out, seek feedback, reflect on ourselves, and hold the totality in mind. In order to open up to possibilities and reinvention, we need to step away from a limited view of ourselves, be curious, and redefine who we are.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. And so, so vivid. Just we talked a bit earlier about identities and just how partial they are depending on who we're with. And it's so contextualized, isn't it?
Yeah. And very difficult to take up that position you described on the edge sometimes. In the helping professions, we sort of credit ourselves with that capacity to observe, but we're not always so good at the piece around introspection and the due diligence we need to do on ourselves, even though it's our world and what we're encouraging our clients to do often.
Yeah, and the more I think about coaching and therapy and that kind of the reflective practice of a consultant, the more I realize that, we often think we have this independent view, but there's actually a lot of ideology attached to kind of what we do. The therapy language, just the different schools of therapy. If you get trained as a cognitive behaviorist, it's quite different to being trained as a psychoanalyst, and you take a quite different perspective on the client work and on yourself and what your role is. And it's yeah, I think like trying to see coaching and consultancy through this lens of a bigger picture. What are you actually doing, rather than kind of just going and observing. From what position are you observing?
Yes, yeah. And there's also inevitably this sort of hierarchy of what's the most sophisticated, insightful, and clever way to do this work. And this sort of comparison between what we're doing, as if one doesn't have a place and another does. And I think that this value in an integrative approach, which allows people to perhaps, absorb some of the more practical techniques alongside some sophisticated thinking, is really helpful. We don't have to be just one thing.
No. And one thing I've moved towards, I wrote a blog on LinkedIn recently, and it's about this idea I work with around, we talk about composting and weaving, because I used to talk a lot about reflection. And I've been thinking about how much of like reflection is quite a cognitive sort of thinking, rational, way of doing things, and just how much we carry in our bodies. I become more and more aware of kind of emotions, feelings, unconscious. It's so much carried in our bodies, and you can't start by thinking. You have to kind of do this pre-work, which is kind of like listening to your body, listening to the unconscious, and then kind of thinking arises from that. Is kind of work we're doing, and then how you weave that together with your clients.
It reminds me of sort of Beyond's later work on the concept of O, and the idea of sort of presence and being there, and also the link to spirituality in the work we're doing. But it's as you say, the position we take in an informed way, whether that's from consciously thinking what we're bringing physically and spiritually, to a decision to perhaps work in a very practical way, or indeed to do dream work or other kind of approaches.
Yeah. A lot of work I'm doing at the moment is trying to disrupt sort of the rational, the cognitive, to try and get into this space. I notice and I'm noticing the impact it has on people. That really, it's like we're so conditioned in the workplace to kind of be manic, focused, delivery. It's quite to hold open a different space is quite a revelation to many people.
Yeah, I think the other thing that feels almost kind of dangerous, but on the other sort of end of the spectrum, is bringing love into the coaching work. And Yetunde Hoffman's work on that, I think, is really helpful. That this compartmentalization of our emotional self and the loving feelings that exist in helping relationship are so powerful, and naming that can be almost risky as well.
Yeah. No, it is. There's an interesting dilemma at work, that people talk about bringing your authentic self to work. That they this is kind of an oft-used phrase, and bringing your whole self to work. And yet there's kind of many brackets around that and limits to that, aren't there?
Yeah. And I think that I certainly might well have encouraged people to take a perspective on the whole person when I'm teaching coaching and working with them. But of course, there are some parts of ourselves that are best kept to ourselves, and not necessarily relevant in the workplace.
Yeah, no, it's a dilemma, because the big corporates, your Googles and stuff, they want you to bring your whole self to work, and they want you to live at work, and they create kind of great canteens and rest places, and so that you can spend 17 hours a day. They get pharmacists and supermarkets.
Mm.
Like you never have to leave work. There's a method in their madness, to extract
Mm.
the maximum, So it is a question, like, I think it's a big question for our times, really. And particularly post COVID, when we're working online, a lot of us are working at home more. The boundary between kind of home life, personal life, work life is, big questions are being asked about it.
Yeah. And I think that allowing ourselves that space to think, when you're immersed in a work environment where you're able to eat together, play together, spend all your time together, there is no time for that. Peering out the window, being in silence, giving yourself the opportunity for moving from one stage to the next. And I think that's missing, and certainly was very evident during COVID times when we had our Zoom calendars back to back and no interruption in between.
Yeah, yeah, and moving from the big meeting or the teaching session online straight into the kind of family kitchen and bumping
Mm,
into a whole lot of other emotions.
mm.
It's
I
interesting.
guess that's one thing that we could think about in terms of rethinking ourselves, is that this idea of what it means to be productive.
Mhm.
What is a meaningful day at work? Does it have to be that you've got a diary that's jam packed with networking and seeking business and sharing ideas, or could we actually rethink ourselves so that the importance of having space, of having quiet time, of having meetings that don't have a particular agenda, let's see where it goes, is a lovely thought for me in terms of reframing my thinking around work.
Yeah, no, it's something I've been doing for quite a while now, and it's I'm kind of intrigued because people always say to me, "Simon, you're super productive. Like, how did you keep throwing all this stuff out?" And
Yeah.
at the moment, I've got one book on the go, two book chapters, a paper, running the Ecological Institute, working for Save the Children, and and it's sometimes it feels, wow, that's really busy. And yet every day I take time off to walk the dog, I go for a cycle, I kind of, and I know it's absolutely essential, like, to my capacity to be kind of productive or kind of thoughtful depends on this. Like, this is kind of life giving, and there's some, that idea less is more actually does kind of it
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
I was working with a client yesterday who was describing the way they're a director of a pretty well known theatre, and they were talking about how in the cycle of a production, um, they get gradually more and more depleted with the energy required to actually deliver something which is profoundly complex but is understood by an audience. And we were talking about ways in which to introduce that less is more, so that there is space to restore ourselves and to have an opportunity to build so that we can then do more.
Yeah, and moving into this future, which we touched on before, can look bleak, but there's the environmental stuff going on that I think, I talk about the precarious interdependent world. It's like we're not ever going to go back to a stable world, not in our lifetimes anyway. It is going to be polycrisis. It's going to be very much technological disrupted, environmentally disrupted. This is kind of how we have to live. We have to kind of learn to live like that, and that asks questions of us quite differently to kind of how we were thinking in the last century, where it was all about progress and stability and kind of it's quite a different kind of proposition.
Yeah, and this sense of really not knowing what
Mm.
might be, what our work might look like, what might be expected of us, and the loss that's involved in that. We sort of arrive at a place of knowing what our contribution is, and almost as soon as we've got there, there's a rejig, and we need to sort of think about doing things in another way. But that again can be really exciting. We don't know what's next, and, where we might be directing our energies. And some of the things that you're doing, might not have been at all what you expected
Mhm.
a decade ago.
No, that's right. And there's something, I read particularly feminist writers, Donna Haraway and a few others on this precarious world we live in. And they point to this, that actually, like if you're in extreme precarity, like, if you're really living at the edge, it's dangerous, it's frightening, it's scary. There's nothing pleasant in that. But also, if you live in a very stable, fixed space, it can be very alienating, very disenchanting. To have some precarity and to live with precariousness is to be alive. To have the right balance of it, to have enough of it, it is energizing. It is kind of, I know from being an entrepreneur, and like from working for yourself, it's very different from having a job, because you have to kind of be alert to kind of opportunities, and you have to be adaptive, and there's something very enlivening about that as well. And I think that's part of it, not just to kind of say it's a negative, that actually there is kind of to be more adaptive, to be more relational as well with other people, with kind of nature, is really kind of re-enchanting, as I talk about.
Yeah, I think one of the things I actually talk about in the book is this sort of danger zone of comfort. Being successful, being appreciated, knowing what you're doing, being in an environment where things are going well can actually be the worst thing to happen to you, because you then don't move, and it's only by sort of stepping out and pushing yourself that you do have a chance to grow and to find other possibilities. One other thing that often people talk about when they're sort of feeling there's a great risk in making a change is that, we don't have to always pursue the things we've tried. We might have a go at something. It might not work. We might return. We might go somewhere else. And this idea that it's all linear in terms of our work life and our kind of relationships just doesn't work. It's as iterative as research is, and as, any kind of process is. So it's being kind enough to yourself to allow your trajectory to be a little bit kind of here and there.
Yeah. And people have so much diversity. It's, some people really are suited to more stable jobs. Some people are suited to be entrepreneurs. There's so much kind of diversity amongst us, and not to expect everyone to kind of be super creative innovators, and that's a few people, and other people will kind of and all these roles are really important, all these kind of roles in life, to value them all, I think is really is something else which is important.
Yeah, and I guess the big work that needs to be done is, what do you value? So, one might have a societally very attractive role with status and money and all sorts, but it's not feeding your soul, it's not giving you joy. And that then is something for you to sort of work on, because all the external strokes and pleasures that you get from perhaps being lauded as someone might not actually be doing you at your core any good at all.
That's right. Let me this book, I'm gonna plug it for
Thank you.
I'd like to just read one bit which really touched me, and it's towards the end of the book, and it's on transience. So let me just read a small piece from this. I have always loved Freud's 1960 essay on transience, not just because it's short. It beautifully captures the value of being in the moment, the inevitability of death, the importance of appreciating the natural world around you, of recognizing that life is fleeting and needs to be embraced, that even with temporal limitation, we can still value short experiences and moments of wonder. Freud wrote this paper at a time when the world was in flux. 2 of his sons were fighting in the First World War, and Freud was particularly eloquent about the beauty of life, despite its transience. His writing was inspired by a walk in the forest with a young poet, bereft at the prospect of the loss of beauty in the flourishing summer landscape that would soon die away. His paper ends with hope that lost objects will be replaced with new, and possibly even more precious objects, even after the losses of war. Objects in this context are not just things, but they could be people, or things that represent a person or a part of a person. There is hope that life will be rebuilt and enduring. So we may be inspired by the sentiment when we think of what will be left behind as we embrace our new identity, our new job, our new way of being. It remains part of what made us who we are. That phrase, that learning, those experiences brought us to now, to our current reinvention, one that may evolve again and again. That's really lovely, Susan.
Oh, thank you, Simon, and thank you for reading it. I was quite enjoying that. Thank you so much. What strikes me is that, Freud wrote that, over 100 years ago, and here we are again.
Yeah.
And we have to hold on to that hope, don't we? And hold on to that light.
We do, yeah. And as you know, in my life, I've suffered a lot of losses, and that those glimpses of beauty, those glimpses of love, those glimpses of grace, they do sustain you through the worst of times. And there is the potential of a reinvention, and whilst recognizing, great loss and sadness. So yeah, that really spoke to me.
Well, thank you. And Freud, of course, who was the master of reinvention, through his models of thinking, through his theory, through his actions. And I often wonder how he would respond to, technology and the world today. And I feel quite sure that he would cope pretty well and come up with something else to help us think differently.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes people kind of take Freud out of context, and it's a bit like your elephant. They just look at one part and say, well, Freud said this. And I'm like, well, no, he actually evolved his thinking every day. It was like, every new book was involved. And he was like changing and reevaluating and rethinking and rediscovering. Is really quite an interesting journey.
Yeah. And one that I hope everybody will consider for themselves as well, that in our own small ways, we can always rethink and reevaluate and not be who we were yesterday.
That's right. We're coming to an end, Susan, and the questions I asked. So
yeah,
let's ask you, what tips do you have, or thoughts, any associations towards what it means to live a good life and to create a good society?
Gosh, we have talked a lot about some of those big ideas today, but I think the thing that I carry with me in terms of meaning in life is that kind of in one pocket, we've got a grain of sand, which shows us how small we are, how inconsequential our lives are, how little we matter in terms of the universe. And the other pocket is a grain of sand to remind us of how influential we can be, how much we can do, how one small act or one small conversation or one thought that we share can really transform the way someone might live. So I think that kind of holding of our limitations, but also our potential is, I think, a good thing to live life by.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, for being courageous. Keep shining, and hope we can keep working together along the way.
Me too. Thank you, Simon, for all you're doing and sharing.